Welcome to the OK Let's Learn podcast, where we dive into books and stories in our OK Book Club, and we dive into people and tons of different topics. My name is Kevin O'Keefe. So today, let's learn about the year 1811 in the new United States of America. America, during this time, the United States of America, during this time, was still a very young country, not even 30 years old yet. There were no queens, there were no kings, there were no royal palaces. Instead, there was something brand new in the world stage. It was a nation trying to rule itself by the people and for the people. It was a new form of government, and it was only, like I said, 30 years old at this point in 1811. It was only a few decades earlier, from 1775 to 1783, where the American colonies had fought a long and difficult war against their parents, against the very own people that they grew up with. Yes, it was Great Britain. This war was called the American Revolutionary War, and against all odds, the colonies, the teenagers, rised up against their parents and won. When the fighting ended, the 13 colonies became officially 13 states, the United States of America. Winning independence was only the beginning, though. The American people did not want another king telling them what to do, so they started a government where the leaders were chosen by the people, a foundational understanding of democracy. But democracy at its core is the people voting for everything. And we don't have a true democracy in that sense. Like I said, it's very important to understand this democracy and the understanding that people have a say in making their laws. This all started back in ancient Greece, in previous episode where I've talked about Greece. But we are a representative democracy. It's where the citizens don't vote on all the laws directly, but we elect officials, people that represent our interest and make decisions on our behalf. So we have an interesting power share between our government and, which is called our federal government, and the states. This system is known as federalism. So it basically ensures that both interests have a say. And my final point on this before we go forward, we have a constitution. So ultimately, our government is based on the authority that comes from this one document. And this is the law of the land. So technically, yes, our United States of America today and going back to 1811 is technically a constitutional federal republic, which has its foundation with people ruling, not just kings and queens, because this is where you were born, this is who you are, that you're a ruler. No, and this was a fundamental change for the world. So it was in this environment, rising out of the American Revolution and the Treaty of Paris in 1783, where we became a new country. But our original founding document was something called the Articles of Confederation. And what that did is it gave too much power to the individual states. And we knew this. When I say we, most people knew that this was going to be a problem that had to be fixed, and it was fixed by a lot of important people that got together in Philadelphia in 1787. We're talking about people like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and a new person that had come on the scene, and his name was James Madison. And oh yeah, don't forget about Alexander Hamilton. Both James Madison and Alexander Hamilton wanted our new country in this early years to be dramatically different. They both wanted a united government and a United States of America, but they came at it from different vantage points. James Madison, he wanted more power for the states. Alexander Hamilton, he wanted more power in the federal government. So both of them crafted through a lot of negotiations with a lot of different people, our founding fathers, and ultimately, yes, with Alexander Hamilton, basically taking all the states' debts, having the federal government absorb those debts, creating, in effect, a new power center in the national government, but still retaining lots of rights with the states. So what ended up happening? This new document was written up called our Constitution, and with these founding fathers getting together, they elected a new president who was George Washington, and off we went. So as the years passed, the United States grew. We had new states now, other than the original 13 states. We had Vermont that joined the Union, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio. And in 1803, President Thomas Jefferson, the third president, made one of the most important decisions in our history. He bought a huge amount of land from France in a deal that was called the Louisiana Purchase. This purchase doubled the size of the United States, and it gave us more lands to basically become a national powerhouse. But we were still a teenager. We still did not have a big navy. We did not have a big army. We were still growing. But to back up here for a second, you can't underestimate the huge deal, not only in just a purchase of the lands of all this territory, but the impact on this new growing country. You see, what happened was, over in Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte, who was the leader of France at this time, he was looking to conquer most of Europe, and he was going up against our old parent, Great Britain. They were fighting a war together, and Napoleon needed money. So again, in 1803, we ended up purchasing this land from France, and it was helpful, obviously, for Napoleon, but it was 100 times better for us. These wars that were being fought were known at the time as the Napoleonic Wars. And like I said, it was named after Napoleon Bonaparte. And Britain was determined to stop his aggression. But we didn't want to be involved. And we weren't. We were on the other side of the ocean. And in fact, we were quote unquote friends with both France and Great Britain. And we hoped to stay neutral. Neutral basically means, hey, we're not supporting or we're not rooting for either one of you. We're not part of this fight. So we consider them friends. And this idea about just staying out of their conflict and their war turned out to be a lot harder than we had thought. It was during this time that clearly we, the United States, depended on trade. Farmers and merchants here, we sent goods like flour and tobacco across the ocean, and in return, we got items that we didn't have necessarily that we needed, like sugar, coffee, cocoa, that were often not just coming from the mainland in Europe, but from some of the other colonies that were controlled in the Caribbean by Britain and France. So trade helped us. It helped us with our economy. It helped us to grow wealthier. But obviously, with the war happening and our two biggest trading partners not wanting us to support the other, well, here's what happened. Britain said, you know what? United States, you can't trade with France. France said, you know what? United States, you can't trade with Britain. So they ended up Britain and France tried to hurt each other, and that got us involved. How? We couldn't trade with anybody anymore. So ultimately, two things happened. we decided to pass a law that said, you know what, we're not going to trade with anybody anymore. We actually thought this was Thomas Jefferson in 1807. They called it the Embargo Act of 1807. President Jefferson thought that, hey, you know what? If we don't send you any goods, Britain and France, food, raw materials that you're going to need to fight your war, then you're going to be coming back to us, pleading with us to keep the trading going. It was a total debacle. And then 2 years later, because that failed, not trading with anybody, it hurt us. We said, all right, you know what? We're going to open up trade with everyone except Britain and France. So, again, it didn't work. It got so bad, and this is so overlooked and very rarely talked about. Some of the New England states who were hit the hardest got together and met and were actually talked about leaving the United States of America. But begrudgingly, what ultimately historians look back at this time and most agree, and it didn't all happen at once, but this ended up planting the seeds for a lot of people in our country saying we can't rely on foreign powers, countries across the ocean to manufacture our goods. So ultimately, like I said, didn't happen immediately, but going forward, there was this consensus that with exports dropping 75%, we realized that we have to start manufacturing our own goods in our own country. But this wasn't the only problem in 1811. What was also happening was happening out on the seas, and this became more of a flashpoint for the average American rather than just arguing over trade. You see, British ships were coming and taking and kidnapping our own sailors from our own ships. Yes, this happened for many reasons, primarily because the British Navy, living with being on boats for the British, it was tough life. They worked long hours, they lived in terrible conditions, and they, believe it or not, they faced severe punishments. So a lot of sailors deserted. The British didn't have enough sailors to replace them. British naval officers began stopping ships on the high seas and forcing sailors to join the British Navy. And they came primarily after us. Why did they do that? Like I said, they didn't have enough. Why didn't they have enough? Because they were fighting the French and Napoleon on the other side of the world. And from their perspective, they were saying, well, listen, you guys are deserters. You guys belong to us. It was only a short time ago that, in fact, you were sailors in our Navy. But this wasn't true. Of course, for the most part, this was 30 years later. So this practice where American sailors were captured, dragged onto British ships, and forced to serve, being taken away from their homes, their families, and their country, this practice was called impressment. Impressment. And we were furious. 1811, this was another rallying cry across the United States that we needed to do something. Yes, we were a teenager. Yes, we were trying to find our way. But many people in Congress who were known as the War Hawks said, you know what? If we're ever going to have a seat at the table as one of the most powerful nations in the world, we need to grow up, and we need to grow up fast, and we cannot have these nations bullying us, pushing us around, primarily our old parent and our old enemy, Britain. And finally, in 1811, here's what else was happening. Native American tribes in the Western Territories, the Ohio River Valley, and what is really at that time known as the Northwest Territory. Today's states of Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, part of Minnesota. Well, Native Americans were causing problems for us going westward. And listen, as we look back on this time period, it is a difficult subject to talk about. You have these people that lived here in this land for ages, thousands of years, and all of a sudden you got new people here coming over from Europe. And in this case, it was our new nation that basically said, hey, you know what, we're coming in here and now this is our land. So it was natural there would be tensions. But from our vantage point, the tensions really came from the fact that we believed that the British were supplying weapons to the Native Americans to fight against us. You see, Britain still was here on our continent. Canada wasn't independent Canada at this time. It was Britain. So there was also the call from people in Congress, the War Hawks, to say, you know what, we need to get Britain out of here completely, off of the hemisphere. So we need to actually have Canada be part of the United States, along with Florida. So it was in 1811 where tensions hit a boiling point, and there was the Battle of Tippecanoe, which will definitely be a future episode. What happened? The U.S., led by a future president, William Henry Harrison, was ambushed in the early morning hours by Tecumseh, a Shawnee tribe leader, and his brother. It was a fierce battle, one again where the weapons were supplied by the British. There were casualties on both sides. We ultimately ended up better with territory gains, with us pushing back the Native Americans. But this was, again, another reason why war hawks and people, now including President James Madison, ultimately thought we should go to war against Britain. Now, to wrap up our podcast on this pivotal year in our history, 1811, it's important to understand one more point. As we became a new country, we had signed a treaty called Jay's Treaty with Great Britain that basically said, hey, Britain promised not to get involved or interfere with our business and our activities, which obviously wasn't the case. And back in 1807, there was an incident on the USS Chesapeake, which was a United States ship. A British warship demanded to search the Chesapeake for, apparently, again, they thought British deserters, but ultimately it was about them getting and kidnapping our sailors. But what happened? When they demanded these sailors, we refused. With that, the British ended up killing and wounding a whole bunch of sailors on the ship. This incident, obviously, again, sparked outrage, and all of this was the environment that ultimately, yes, led up to the War of 1812. So it was, as we entered this new year, on June 18th, 1812, President Madison and Congress declared war on Great Britain. This declaration, it wasn't about just the grievances about us asserting our identity and independence, because there were events that led up to our young nation basically testing our resilience and our determination to protect our rights. Yes, there were reasons that we went to war, but ultimately it was about us standing up for what we felt was right and allowing us to, yes, ultimately become equals to the major powers across the world. Friends, thanks for staying with me again on this journey, learning all about the events that led up to the War of 1812. Until next time, reach out to me at kevmok21@gmail.com. Please rate and review me on Apple Podcasts. Always helps. And until next time, have fun and keep learning.